Okay, we are live.
So, welcome back to Senate Judiciary. The topic addressed in the morning is bail, conditions of release. I don't think there's anything more confusing to me trying to explain to my constituents why somebody got released or why somebody's being held on bail and what the requirements are. And I often just get a little frustrated and say, probably you should read the Constitution. So maybe, Ben, if you could start with the Constitution and explain to us Vermont's bail laws, release. I mean, we all hear, I'm sure, about catch and release and how frustrating it is, and people violating conditions of release.
Sure. I realize I never introduced myself for the record. My name is Ben Novogrosky. I work for the Office of Legislative Counsel. So starting with the Constitution, bail is contained in Vermont's Constitution under Chapter 2, Section 40, which is entitled Excessive Bail Prohibited, Prisoners Bailable, Imprisonment for Debt Prohibited. So essentially, excessive bail shall not be exacted for bailable offenses. All persons shall be bailable by sufficient surety. So basically you're providing some money to secure your appearance in court. It's not, from a theoretical perspective, it's not meant to be a punishment or anything like that. It is purely meant to secure your appearance to return to court if you are released in between while the case progresses. However, under the Constitution, a person accused of an offense punishable by death or life imprisonment may be held without bail when the evidence of guilt of the acts violated the court finds by clear and convincing evidence that release poses a substantial threat of violence and conditions to an individual and conditions of release or any combination thereof would not reasonably prevent physical violence.
The standard of when the evidence of guilt is great, how's that standard measured?
First off, bail is all based off of, there has to be a finding probable cause. So it would be done at the arraignment, and it would be based on the prosecutor's argument at that point, probably the police officer's affidavit, and really any other evidence that could be presented at a bail hearing. And again, I think it would be it's dependent on each case, but it would really have to show that there's substantial evidence that physical violence is present and that conditions of release and accommodation really wouldn't be protected. And so that would be as varied as each case, but it would really only be in those cases where there are felonies that involve violence. And again, in those cases that are punishable by life imprisonment or death, which there's no death.
Yes.
Other questions on that? The weight of evidence hearing has to be held within 48 hours or 72 hours.
Yeah, it has to be very quick. I mean, typically it's done almost at the time of arraignment, but yeah, it would have to be, I believe it's within 48 or 72. I'd have to double check on the exact time. But yes, it's it's a threshold issue when someone is charged and arraigned.
So that constitutional provision for holding someone without bail is not only applicable to sentences that would be like without the possibility of parole or the death penalty, but also like those are two examples, but would also include other violent crimes. Yes.
Right. Will that meet those requirements where
right.
The evidence is great and there's just substantial danger.
One more. So it does not include violence.
But it does say that a person waiting sentence or sentence pending appeal may be held without bail. So that would basically be after they're adjudicated guilty, prior to sentencing, during the pendency of an appeal of that sentence, of that conviction. And these are reviewable. There's a court process, you know, for bail review hearings. And like, for instance, when there's a violent felony, the person who's held without bail prior to trial, you know, their case can be reviewed by a single justice of the Supreme Court. It's a de novo review, so they're looking at it with fresh eyes. There's also that a person held without bail prior to trial shall be entitled to review of that by panel 3 Supreme Court justices within 7 days after the bail is denied. And then, except in the cases of an offense punishable by death or life imprisonment, the person is held without bail before trial. The person shall be commenced not more than 60 days after the trial. So that's a speedy trial provision, essentially.
Do we have any data around how many people are held in a given roughly each year without bail?
I'm sure we do. I don't know what that number is. I think that would be something that, again, the Department of Corrections, maybe the Vermont Judiciary would have that information.
What I'd like to do is if we could collect the questions, Ben, and check with the Center for Justice Research. I just see where Monica Lieber is the name of the new director. They may have it. We can check with DOC. And tomorrow tomorrow we have the discussion about the court backlog. I think we could have to ask where that information is. And I think we could all use accurate information on how many people are held without bail, how many people are held with small amounts of bail. There was a case somewhere where it's a very small amount. They agreed the guy couldn't make it. And they wanted to, I guess they just wanted to hold him. And it was like $10. The father wouldn't give it, you know, there was an agreement made, I guess, between everybody ahead of time. The father wouldn't give him the $10. The guy was held really for his own protection, but pretty sad. That's the only place you can be held for your protection.
Well, that would be something I'd be curious to know too, is how many people are held with bail that they can't afford to pay.
Maybe more difficult to
It
find.
may be. I mean, I would assume anyone who has bail and is still sitting in jail probably is there because they can't pay their bail.
Well, I've heard it's difficult, you know, in most states there's bail bonds. You know, we pay 10%. And I don't know how much we have in Vermont. I remember this one time a bail bondsman came and spoke to this committee. There's a different term for them now.
My understanding is a lot of them don't want to come out for just a $200 bail, which poses a problem for any of keeping people in jail.
They want the bigger amounts.
That's my understanding.
Yeah, probably right.
They have to make more money on it.
So those are sort of the constitutional provisions, but bail and recognizances are governed by Title 13, Chapter 229. Talks about the imposition of bail, security appearances. It talks about, you know, releases in cases punishable by life imprisonment.
Is that 229 you said?
That's the chapter, yes.
Okay.
Talks about release prior to trial, what home detention looks like, pretrial risk assessments, needs screenings, the electronic monitoring pilot program. That was something, again, that was recommended by Justice Reinvestment.
We're not doing that anymore, are we? Maybe we should ask that question tomorrow too.
Yeah. Yeah, it ended in 2018, so it was a 4-year program from 2014 to 2018. But it's still on the books. It just hasn't been repealed. It's one of those things to clean up during the statutory revision. I'm sorry, Senator.
I'll try to remember to ask that tomorrow, but if I forget that somebody asked about the electronic detention.
I'm making a note.
But my memory's so bad about. I don't know what happens.
Like that digger.
No, we were talking about the home detention program
Oh,
that ended in 2018, but we've never asked why, that I can remember, nor have we asked.
wasn't, that was with the bracelets? Or the-
Yeah.
I thought the problem was that they wouldn't, that the Wi-Fi was so bad that they couldn't get it to work in the
But now that
room.
Governor Scott's got Wi-Fi everywhere.
Except at your house.
Except mine. Well, that's actually my problem, my extender.
Maybe one of those bracelets has better.
Yeah, maybe I should get a bracelet.
And to your question before, Senator Sears, it is within 48 hours that probable cause will be found to be held on bail. And so after.
Go on your desk.
Sorry. Go ahead.
So, typically how this would play out in court cases, that someone is arraigned, let's just say it would be a DUI charge, right? Someone's arraigned, and they're released back into the community, but oftentimes there would be conditions of release relevant to the charge itself, so that while someone is out in the community, again, securing their appearance so when they have to come back to court for either status conference or for suppression hearing or for trial. But typically those conditions of release are also aimed to protect the public. So it may be that you cannot consume or possess alcohol, or you can't drive, or that you have to enter into some sort of pretrial services program and go to counseling, things like that. And that would be, there's a form that's written, it would be signed by the attorneys, by the defendant, by the judge. And so you're accepting, well, it's by the defendant and the judge, and you're accepting acknowledgement of those conditions of release for you to be, to go back into the community. But there are various different programs that, that help protect the community and also secure an appearance back into court. I mentioned sort of the pretrial services programs, and there really are multiple steps along the way. And these are sort of the restorative justice approaches to our criminal justice system that's aimed to keep people out of prison, but also sort of have a rehabilitative angle to them. For instance, so there's court diversion. Diversion for lower level crimes oftentimes, especially for first offenders, is a contract-based system. So it would be an agreement between the diversion provider, and diversion is an attorney general. Office of the Attorney General administers court diversion, and they have an adult program, they have a juvenile program. And it would be a contract-based system where the defendant or the offender in that case would have to complete certain sets of conditions, and then the case would be, they would be subject to the case, there would be a record of it. It's out of the system altogether. There are pretrial services, which again are all.
Are there fees associated with participating in court diversion?
I believe so. It depends on, I think you have to, sometimes those conditions are engaging with counseling and things like that. And I think that there are fees associated with those services.
But do you have to pay a fee simply to participate in diversion?
No,
Okay.
I don't believe so. But I can double check that.
Well, one of the other things about diversion is it usually involves the victim.
Right, exactly, and they're involved in the process, and to kind of give, I'll give an overview of these. So court diversion is governed by 3 VSA 163 and 164, and court diversion case managers work with those referred who are willing to take responsibility. That is a key part. They have to take responsibility for their actions and engage in a restorative process aimed at repairing the harm that they potentially caused. Service needs related to the delinquency petition or charge are addressed in that agreement, that contract. And then the completion of the diversion program results in the dismissal of the charge, and automatic expungement follows 2 years after dismissal. There's also the Tamarack program. This is governed by
Can I ask
three.
a quick question? Sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead, please.
What, is there a list of what crimes diversion covers?
There is, and it's in that statute.
If you just want to give me the statute, I can look it
Yeah,
up.
163 and 164,
In Title 13.
Title 3,
Title 3.
which is the Attorney General. So there's also the Tamarack program, which is also in 164B2. This is a program for adults and youth aged 18 or older who are charged with a crime or delinquency, who have a substance use or mental health treatment need, regardless of their criminal history. So prosecutors have the ability to refer before or after arraignment to the Tamarack program. The staff in this program quickly connect with the participants to substance use, mental health, and other supportive community-based services. They must be willing, again, to take responsibility for their actions and engage in that restorative process aimed at repairing the harm. We'll see a theme in a lot of these programs of it's engaging in the process, taking responsibility, and trying to repair the harm. The service needs related to the charge are addressed in that contract agreement again, and then completion of that program also results in the dismissal of the delinquency or criminal charge, and expungement will follow 2 years after the fact. So very similar, but just with a different angle aimed towards mental health and substance use needs.
One of the things that we did find is that there are geographic disparities in terms of what is offered and who it's offered to around the state. For example, there isn't much pre-charge programming in Bennington County. There's a lot in Chittenden County. And it depends on the state's attorney, but it also depends upon what's offered for services in those communities. And it's one of the more confusing things that I tried to deal with this summer on justice oversight, was that whole review of the alternative programming. For example, Winooski has its own justice. Bennington County is all one, so that person's only applying to, but has to apply to 3 different state agencies for grants. And then is now involved in an after-school program, which is a different state agency. So then it's one board and one group, but it's doing all of it. And in Chittenden County, I think we've got like 7 or 8 different entities.
Yeah. And I'll go into sort of how community justice centers and how that is almost a misnomer in a way, because it's really a conglomeration of programs. I'll get to that in a minute.
I didn't mean to jump in.
No, you're fine. I mean, it's all really independent.
But I'm confused.
Yeah, it's not a simple process. Senator Sheen, just to correct myself, so there isn't really a list of offenses. What it is that each state's attorney, in cooperation with the AG's office, basically can develop a list of offenses that are subject to diversion. And that goes to your point, Senator Sears, where there may be sort of that geographic inconsistency from county to county and prosecutor to prosecutor.
And diversion is up to prosecutorial discretion. It's not sort of the automatic path for those offenses.
Correct. Yeah, there is no mandatory path as of yet. Another program is pre-trial services, which I alluded to in sort of that DUI example. That's governed by 13 VSA section 7554C. And this is a service for adults and youth aged 18 or older with substance use or mental health treatment needs. They're going through the court process and are awaiting final case disposition. Court can order the defendant to meet with a coordinator, participate in a needs screening assessment, or a clinical assessment, and then they must follow the recommendations of that provider. Individuals may also choose to engage with pretrial services, which is a provided system through a lot of these community justice centers or whoever the administrators of these programs are. A person's refusal to engage them does not result in a violation of conditions of release, but they're often kind of a strong suggestion included in the arraignment. Pretrial service coordinators screen people for their treatment needs. They help people make and keep appointments for their clinical assessments and treatment. They also connect defendants with recovery supports and other services. They only report to the court, to the prosecutor, and the defense attorney whether clinical assessments or treatment is indicated. Whether a person completed an assessment and if further engagement is needed after the initial screening and recommendations. There's also the Youth Substance Awareness Safety Program governed by both 7 VSA Section 656 and 18 VSA Section 4230B. This provides an alternative to the civil court process for youth who violate Vermont's underage alcohol, cannabis, or epinephrine laws. It helps young people understand the impact on themselves and others of using substances and to lower their risk of future use. It also connects those identified as using at high risk levels to professional substance use clinicians. Vermont statutes direct law enforcement to refer youth to these programs. And then there's the DLS diversion program under Act 147 of the 2011 session. The goal of the driving with a license suspended diversion program is to restore people's privilege to drive by helping them to determine the requirements for driver relicensing and by providing an alternative affordable means to satisfy those requirements. People participate following a court diversion referral by a prosecutor or referred by another community provider, family member, or friend. So those are the sort of restorative justice approaches that are governed by the Attorney General's office.
Maybe we should get an update on DLS again. It's been a few years.
Okay.
And I have a feeling that we're going backwards again.
So when you say an update just on the.
Maybe next week we could have an agenda item for the Department of Motor Vehicles and Department of Public Safety come in and let us know how they're doing. And of course, the DLS, because at one point we had 67 state of 250,000 people, we had 67,000 DLSs, individuals.
That's crazy. Wow. Does the
It'd be
AG,
good to get an update on where we're at with that. If you could bring the statute, where we're at with that. Or somebody else, I don't want to put, it's not up to me to assign you.
No, that's my subject area though. So yeah, all DUI related stuff. And DLS always the.
Well, one of the surprise things of this committee, we have policy over auto insurance, which does affect DLS because if they're driving without a license, they probably don't have insurance.
But I'd be happy to.
does the Attorney General's office track statistics for how frequently these different programs are used?
I'm not sure if the Attorney General's office does, but I do know that the individual program administrators, so, be it the Burlington CJC or like there's Loyal Valley Health and Services, they do track numbers. I would like to think that the Attorney General's office does, but I can't say for sure.
I'd love to see the numbers for each of these and like how often they're like being used in comparison to other methods.
For each one of these programs? Okay.
And I mean, if it's broken down, because I am concerned about geographic disparity. I heard last night the Northeast Kingdom has 0, community justice disparity, but also looking at ways to increase the use of.
And there was some data provided to the Justice Oversight Committee this summer. Let me go back through that to see if that's included, and if not, we can follow up.
Well, but there's 3 different departments involved. That's part of the other problem. You have not only the Attorney General's office, those the community justice centers, but then you have DCF, Devon, Lafarge, and then you have DOC has their own, so that they're funding it. So there's
yeah. Well, and I think that's probably a good segue into sort of describing what community justice centers are, and really sort of how they're not necessarily a center where someone can go to all the time. So, really what it is a conglomeration of services. So, and this is really informed by the evolution of the laws and the current structure of the CJC and DOC statutes, which provide CJCs with discretion to achieve restorative justice programming goals. While this provides local communities the ability to sort of tailor the restorative justice programming to each community's needs, it does create inconsistencies in the scope and application of CJCs and their programming throughout Vermont. These disparities can affect entity structures, programming and services provided, and the funding itself. One of the primary issues is that moniker of Community Justice Center. What is often thought of as a facility is really a conglomeration of programming administered by DOC, who actually have authority over the CJCs through statute, the Attorney General's office, and the Department for Children and Families. So the facility in a municipality that houses these programs is often referred to as a CJC, but it isn't necessarily governed by the CJC statute. So for instance, there are many other services associated with that moniker of CJCs. There are the ones that are governed by the Attorney General's program office, which I just went over, and DCF, which is the BARGE program, the Balance and Restorative Justice Initiative. So we went over the AG's programs, and what the BARGE program is another program, but it's not found in statute. It's a contract-based program that started in 1999 to provide restorative justice services for youth. The DCF contracts with providers to offer case management services, restitution services, screening, and other restorative services and classes and skill development. And then there's DOC, and DOC in statute actually has restorative justice policy. That is in 28 section 2A. And that was under section 2A. It empowers communities to respond to a person's wrongdoing at its earliest onset. It tailors the sanctions based on each circumstance. The implementation of the policy requires law enforcement officials to employ restorative justice approaches in court diversion, sentencing, and with individuals under the supervision of DOC. The commissioner of the DOC is provided with the authority to establish reparative boards and delegate authority to community boards and to justice centers themselves. While most justice centers, while I think the initial intent was that for the municipalities to run them, they're often administered by nonprofit organizations now. I believe Burlington may be one of the only, if not the only, municipality that actually has a community justice center under the guise of municipality. And this really evolved over time. I mean, these statutes evolved over the course of 30 years, and so you may wonder why certain statutes live in certain places. For instance, so Title 28 is the title that governs the Department of Corrections, but it has everything about restorative justice. You might wonder, well, why? And Senator Sheen, you kind of, you assume, well, the Attorney General's diversion programs, all that probably should be in Title 13, but no, it's under Title 3, which governs the Attorney General. So there's not necessarily a logical flow and organization to these things, and that's just because of their evolution. There's an apt analogy from the Restorative Justice Executive, Derek Mudovnik, for the Department of Corrections, and he really refers to community justice centers as an antique Vermont house that has been added to over the time, and it's kind of rickety and creaks, but it works. But it's not necessarily the most efficient or logical home for all of these things. And I think it really is an apt comparison. But the CJC statute itself lives in Title 28, Chapter 58. And it gives a lot of sort of broad stroke volunteers to acquire funding, to share information and analysis with the Agency of Human Services, which oversees the Department of Corrections. they can get funding through AHS, but it also, they can apply for grants and gifts and other fundings to help administer these programs. Prior to 2008, it was really just DOC that governed through these series of statutes. It started when you look back in 1989. That was the first time that a statute was passed that really governed these restorative programs. It was authorized through community-based halfway houses and programs in 28 VSA section 911. This evolved into creating alternatives to incarceration boards. This evolved into reparative boards, which many municipalities still have today. And the commissioner still has this authority to run these reparative boards and all that, but it has evolved into what we see now as this conglomeration of services through DOC, the AG's office, and DCF. So the funding structure is really the other piece of all of this. It's not that it's really this sort of decentralization of administration of the services. It's also the way it's funded. And I discussed it briefly before, where these are really all grant-based funding programs where these program administrators will apply to the various agencies for grants. So for instance, like the AG's Community Justice Program Award grants, they vary county to county. Fiscal year 2022 in Addison County was 199,000, but in Bennington was 208,000. The highest it looks like is Chittenden County at 475. But the lowest is 179 for Caledonia, and it was Orange at 153. So you have almost $100,000 worth of disparity in the grants awarded just by the AG's office, and you can extrapolate that out for DOC.
Is there anything in the Northeast Kingdom? Did you have that list?
There's Caledonia and Essex County. I think it's all 14.
Is there Orleans County?
There is Orleans County as well.
So they do have. I think it's Essex that doesn't have one specifically.
Right. And that's the underlying theme here as well, is that there are these services that may not be available to the people that are being released. And so there is that sort of geographic equity or inequity piece. While again, there's that whole tailoring that these communities can provide to the people that need the help, but there aren't always the services available nearby to provide the services that they need.
And there's no direct appropriation, it's all grant funded.
Yeah, the direct appropriations go to the AG's office, DCF, or to DOC, and then they administer the grants themselves.
Okay.
And so a lot of these programs are bringing it back to bail and conditions of release. A lot of these services are leaned on in those when people are released, because they have to follow those programs, be it or what have you. But it's just once they're out, and there's no way to pull out release. They can be cited for that, and then they can come back hailed back into court, and we'll have to answer that. And there are ways to pull people back who don't follow the conditions that the court sets for them. So that's a very broad overview of the different systems in place, the funding, and the potential issues as well.
Great, thank you. Quick question, just out of curiosity, which agency is or was responsible for coming up with the template for conditions of release?
I think the Vermont Judiciary came up with the form itself.
Thank you. I've seen some weak.
I think, still going back to my question. somebody's arrested for an act that they're released with conditions. Do we have any idea how often the courts look at those conditions, review violations of those conditions, and then impose bail? I mean, that's another question for tomorrow, I guess.
Yeah, I don't have that information.
How does that impact us? Because that's, and I'm thinking of this guy in Bennington that ran for the state senate 4 years ago, and always carrying a firearm with him. And I remember where he goes, that's why he carries a firearm, because you will need me to defend you. So then he's at town meeting day last March. He and a former representative get into an argument about who's taking videos of each other being jerks. And that's a common term in Bennington. And so they both get stalking orders against each other. The candidate carrying the firearm, violates the stalking order according to the former representative. So there's an arrest warrant issued for him, and he's still unable, they still haven't caught him, even though he's running for governor. In November, they couldn't catch him. He had to cancel a waiver of presumption appearance. Seriously, I'm not making that up.
You can't make this stuff up.
No, and so, because he didn't want to get arrested. But now we're into January. Nobody's caught him, nobody's done anything. Is there anything in the books about conditions of release for the violations, what directions there are?
As far as directions,
Yeah, in the courts.
I mean, you violate the condition of release. I mean, you can get an arrest warrant depending on the violation, and you can be brought back and cited and brought back in. I mean, that's really the only way to enforce it. But if someone can't be found, I suppose that's the missing link in that system.
Yeah, quite a few votes.
Any other questions as far as?
I thought there was going to be this secret solution for me to just write back to people and say, the way it is, we're not in New York.
Well, we are in New York. I mean, New York did get rid of cash bail, and that's still in existence here.
It's fair to say that it can be individualized.
The bail or
Yeah,
conditions?
bail. I mean, it's based on the individual and
Absolutely.
I think one of the frustrations in New York was the fact that certain people who may be extremely dangerous, they're not able to use cash bail.
Well, and
Like the guy that attacked the candidate for governor.
Does New York not have a provision about not letting, like, holding someone pre-trial? Like, we have our whole provision around not offering bail to someone who would be extremely dangerous. Do they not have that?
yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to-
That's,
I don't think so. I think when the guy attacked the candidate for governor in New York, they weren't able to hold him.
well, right, but can they just hold him without bail? Because my understanding would be if we ended cash bail, someone who's violent would still be able to be held without bail as they are now. It would just prevent people from being held simply because they can't pay.
Right.
So that's my
That's
question.
how I always understood it.
But that's, the Constitution says you can't hold them because they can't pay, right?
For debts.
Well, excessive and for.
Well,
debt.
except for, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
well, if somebody's murdered, if somebody, the weight of evidence is great, that they murdered somebody, like, we've seen that. I would prefer to have them held.
And they still could
They
be,
still,
just,
Yeah, so,
Risk assessment.
Right,
Right.
like that's my understanding of how the Constitution reads, is even if we eliminated cash bail, people would still be able to be held with no bail as they are now. Like if someone murdered someone, we don't have to offer them cash bail now. Like I don't want someone who, there's great evidence they've murdered someone given cash bail. What if they have the cash bail?
No, that's true. You know, they can be held without bail for those crimes that are subject to life imprisonment or those violent felonies. So yes, there's.
And that would not change if we didn't have a cash bail system.
Well, it depends on what it would look like.
Right.
Theoretically, you're
You
right.
have to look at the bill first.
Yeah.
Of course, but that's it is not wanting to sort of eliminate cash bail in those instances, but frankly, I don't want someone be saying, well, you can go for 10 grand, and then they have 10 grand and they're out. Like I want.
Well, I'm thinking about that case that's in the news right now where a guy's wife disappeared. He misrepresented to the police.
Oh, the Cohasset, yeah.
Yeah, and so then they found DNA evidence and they found that he bought cleaning supplies to clean up blood, et cetera. And he got out on $500,000 bail, which is, you pay 10%, right?
Yeah.
So for 50 grand, he can walk free. And I'm thinking, you know, this is a guy who was already being prosecuted for fraud. Obviously he has, well, not obviously, but looks like he had some kind of horrible break with sanity. And so now for $50,000, he can walk out and flight risk, you know, risk to others. Just, I was amazed that he could hit the street. And
Right. Yeah, so for me, when I think about cash bail, like using cash bail to hold someone like that is really problematic, as opposed to just saying, no, you don't get bail, and we'll get rid of cash bail for anyone we think is fine to be out in the world.
In my understanding of the New York law is that it's eliminates cash bail for most misdemeanors and non-violent felonies. And so they're either free without restriction while the case plays out or under certain
Under
conditions.
restrictions,
How did attacking a candidate not be a violent crime?
That I can't answer.
That was me. I mean, not me personally.
oh,
That again. I don't want to, we will anxiously await the bill. One that we're not going to have, which is to fix the antique house that our diversion programs live under. But I thought it was important to understand what we're up against. I'm afraid if we try to fix it, we'll tear the house down.
It's not retrofittable.
But I do think it's something to keep in mind as we talk about alternatives to our incarceration. You still have to, I would like to see the pre-charge programs more available statewide. If we're talking about, you know, dealing with things like bail and stuff like that, there has to be some alternatives to hold people accountable. Not necessarily opposed to talking about bail, but I don't want to leave, for example, Bennington County without any pre-charge programming that would. You know where the biggest disparity is? It's probably in shoplifting, by the way.
I don't.
County to county, how it gets treated.
Yeah, I don't know which crime has the biggest disparity.
But anyway,
we're not prosecuting anybody. It should be.
yeah,
Back to those hearings we had last
no,
year.
I know.
Well, and that kind of goes to, that's a good point. I mean, and really emphasizing the discretion that prosecutors have. You know, Chittenden County and Washington County, I want to say maybe the only counties that actually have a written policy when it comes to, you know, pre-charge referrals. So those would be ones that law enforcement can refer directly to, you know, a restorative justice program, or which offenses won't be charged. So I believe those are the only two written policies in those subject areas, but otherwise it's really based on sort of the discretion and policy of each prosecutor in each county, and that can change election to election and so on and so forth.
Well, this has been very helpful, Pat. I thank you for the research. This morning it actually refreshed my mind about some of the stuff, and I hope it's been helpful to the committee. We're going to adjourn early, take some time to